All right, I want to welcome you out to the next edition of Talk on Things and Stuff. Today we have an interesting topic and guest that I think is going to be something that I'm hoping we see a lot more movement on in the future, because I think the subject is very, very important. And that is, we're going to be talking about the recent leak of a document that contains over 300 pages of instances of child abuse by leaders of the Mormon Church, in which the church has been involved with resolving the issues, or that there has been some documentation that church leaders either previously knew about the abuse, or that some steps were taken that may be carried the risk of perpetuating or prolonging abuse. We saw something very similar to this documented recently in the Academy Award-winning film Spotlight, where a series of investigative reporters found a trail of clues that led them to a large database in the Catholic Church that really revealed the extent to which abuses were perpetuated and covered up in Boston and around the nation and around the world. And that really broke open the floodgates of people understanding the extent of that type of I don't know if we want to call it cover-up or just policies that perpetuate abuse. So today we have as our guest Ryan McKnight, who is the founder of MormonLeaks, the website that originally released this document. Ryan, how are you doing?
Hey, Jonathan, how you doing? Thanks for inviting me on to talk about this.
Well, I appreciate you being willing to sit down and talk about the document and its basically coming into being. So now, MormonLeaks traditionally leaks or has released documents that are internal to the church. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Or can you tell us a little bit about MormonLeaks just quickly?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the vast majority of what we're doing is we're releasing documents that would be produced by either within the church office building or by high-level leaders, as in the example, like the McConkie papers. He was writing as an apostle and as an area 70. I think what you were sort of alluding to is that this document that we're going to talk about today doesn't necessarily fall into the traditional framework of what we do. And one of the things, and it's not a leak. And so I hope that your listeners understand that this was not a leak, and we didn't promote it as a leak. And in fact, I've had a lot of people asking me why this was not the headline item of the week. We had two other items that were actual leaks that were actually the headline of our press release this past Tuesday. And the reason why we did not do a headline for this document, even though we knew that it would draw a lot of interest, was because we wanted to make sure that people understood that we were not leaking any information, because we know this topic is very explosive. And if there was any confusion there, then it may be taken in a way that would be inaccurate. Also, when you click in our press release on the document, it will take you to our wiki page for the document, and there's a little bit of a longer write-up there that explains that this is an informational post only.
Okay.
And we have a couple of informational posts that we have out there already, and we hope to have more, because we do feel, as we stated in our write-up, that part of promoting transparency is not just leaking internal documents, but just disseminating relevant information that we feel that the public has a right to know, that they can have a benefit from it, that it furthers productive discussion, et cetera, et cetera. And our team, and maybe we can get into this a little bit later, we had extensive debates on not only whether or not we would even release this document, but how to release it. So it was something we took great care in.
Okay, well, I want to get into that just from the perspective of, one of MormonLeaks' just followers. Mm-hmm. When these things came out, first we saw the standard Tuesday release, and it wasn't anything groundbreaking. But then this document came out, and this to me was like just, you know, incidentally lobbing a hand grenade in the middle of everything, because even though, like you say, you know, this document is not internal private stuff, the remarkable thing about this document is you may hear every once in a while, oh, there was a legal case involving some abuse somewhere, and then it just becomes this isolated data point in a cloud that you don't really understand the significance of it. And what this document does is it takes all these little data points from all these different sources, puts them together, and then highlights exactly where the church was involved in the case. And when you see this huge stack of all these data points together, that creates such a tremendous impact, because it's only by looking at those data points that you start to see the pattern, and that you start to see the problem, the nature of the problem.
Yeah,
and that's why, you know,
agree.
I was disappointed, frankly, because of the visibility that your normal releases have. I mean, you've been interviewed by some pretty large news outlets, and so that gives you a significant podium. And
well, let me just say this. I mean, your point is very well received and is a valid point, and was one of the reasons why we spent probably, I could easily say it, months debating the proper release of this. I've had this document for quite a while. I've been working with Deb, who was the creator of the document, for quite some time now. And here's the thing: we want it, and still want it to go as viral as possible. And but we decided that it needed to happen organically, and not because of us sensationalizing a headline that may or may not get taken out of context. And so I'm telling you, it's hard to describe like just how tough the decision was on this thing. But I can tell you that I don't want to speak for my entire MormonLeaks team, but for me, I had a lot of stress in being comfortable with how we properly presented it, because what I did not want to happen, and what I think we all didn't want to happen, was for us to put this out there with a sensationalistic headline, and then people realize that it's an aggregation of public information, and then be accused of sort of, you know, being dishonest and saying that this was a leak, and sort of opening us up to criticism and possibly damaging our overall mission. And so obviously there was the value of releasing it. We knew this had to be released somehow. We didn't have to be the people to release it. I could have said to Deb, I could have said to her, you know, go put this on Facebook and we'll maybe, you know, we'll share your link or something. But we knew that that wouldn't get as much traction. So we did want to use the power that we've built up with our reputation, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we didn't do damage to our other important work that we're doing. And so ultimately, after several weeks, months of consideration, this was the method with which we were comfortable with, and we figured that any kind of viral result, that it would be an organic thing. Now,
okay.
I did contact some media outlets, okay, about this, and the feedback that I got from all of them, well, this is a little tricky on how I can say this, but the main reason why we were not able to find a home for this, as far as a story, was because the document in and of itself is simply a re-reporting on things that have already been reported on. Almost all of the cases have been in the news in some shape or another, even if it's to a small degree. And where the true story was in the person who aggregated it, Deb, who is a fascinating person, and I hope that one day that she can be in a more public position with these things. She is a great advocate and has done many great things, I would say, in the last 6 or 7 years, of which has been the bulk of her advocacy. But, you know, my understanding from what she's told me is that she's limited on how much she can talk about some of these things, because for legal reasons, because of how sex abuse is touched her family.
Okay.
And she has some legal binding. And so we had some news outlets that were interested in doing a story about her and about how, part of her advocacy was compiling this document, but also sort of telling her story, which is very compelling and newsworthy. But legal restraints, is my understanding. I wasn't involved in those conversations with the reporters. I just simply made the connection. And my
Okay.
understanding is that legal restraints prevented that from happening. So there was all kinds of stuff that going on behind the scenes with this document that we had to just make sure that it was done everything the right way. She even
Okay.
had
Well,
to
take
get
us.
this document approved by her attorney to be able to have her name on it.
Wow. Well, take us back to the beginning, the inception of the document, where you first had, and then what was the process of putting it together, just so that we have a sense of what it took to bring this out.
So Deb contacted me at whatever point. I couldn't tell you right now. I'd have to look it up, but it was several months ago. I would guess it was in March or something like that. And she told me her story about how she was been working on this investigation on her own, and I guess
So
there was
she's not affiliated with any. She's not like a data collector for some agency
no,
that's trying to push
no,
for
not at all.
advocacy, and this is totally independent.
Completely. I mean, I guess I don't know if she is retired or if she still works, but she was like some sort of a nurse.
Hmm.
I don't know if she still works as a nurse or not. I know she's an older lady. So it's possible that she's retired, but yeah, she's just a regular lady whose life was touched by sexual abuse. And one of the things that did for her was realize how pervasive it was. It's my understanding that she was unaware of how widespread it was within all religion, but also specifically within the LDS Church, which is the background that she comes from. And I mean, I don't want to like put words in her mouth or try to represent her in any way. So I hope I'm not doing that. But my impression was that she thought that the case that affected her life was an isolated incident, and she soon found out that it wasn't. And that was what motivated her to become an advocate for victims of sexual abuse. She has a group. I know she's advocated in the state that she lives in. It's not Utah. I'm not going to say what state she lives in because I'm not sure if she wants me to, but she's actually has spoken before the legislature in her state and got some changes in laws related to sexual abuse that were key passed. And she has a support group that she runs, and she has been compiling this list for years. And so she contacted me and she's telling me all this, and she said, I've seen the attention that your website has been getting, and I think that maybe I have all this stuff that I would like to bring to light, but I'm a nobody, and I'm thinking maybe your website can help us with that. So initially, what was going to happen was she sent me like 400 files. I don't even know the exact count, but it was around 400 files of every one of these cases, because some of the cases have multiple documents related to them, right?
Right.
So, and they were all very organized. Like you could just look at the file name and basically kind of know what the general gist of it was, if it was a Boy Scout case or, whatever the case may be. And initially we were going to create a wiki page for each case and have, if it was 2 or 3 files for that case, have them on that wiki page and whatnot. But obviously that posed a tremendous amount of work on our end, and it really wasn't very realistic. And she was finally able to consult with her attorney. The reason we were going to do that as opposed to putting her summary up is because she was thinking that there was her legal restraints applied to this document.
Okay.
That she had compiled. But she consulted with her attorney and got the go-ahead from her attorney to publish this summary through us, as opposed to us individually publishing each file. And so when we got that permission, that was great, because as you can see, it's a very user-friendly format. You can just scroll down and click on the links that you want, or you can just read the summaries. And so at that point, once we had permission to do that, it was really just a matter of us at MormonLeaks deciding what we wanted to do. And to be quite frank, that took a long time. And I mean, I had to apologize to Deb several times, because she didn't say this, but I'm sure she probably felt like I was brushing her to the side. I wasn't, but we were taking our time with this, and ultimately we released it last week. So I don't know if that is a good summary. I don't know if I went on too long. If you have any clarifying questions.
That gives us, yeah, that gives us a sense, just in terms of that the genesis of the project seems to be independently with Deb a couple of years ago. And she was working on it based on her own motivations for her own advocacy, and then contacted you as a potential place to give it a broader platform because of the significance of the issue, and yeah. How you guys may be able to get the word out more. And then it sounds like your own internal discussion in terms of keeping you guys trying to separate it from the concept of internal Mormon with aggregating, publicly available documents. And I think that makes sense now. When I first saw this, I immediately had a flashback to when I watched the movie Spotlight, because I think even like when I sat down to watch the movie Spotlight, in my head, I knew that there was some, there was cases about sexual abuse. I knew that, maybe it was a little bit more, but I had no idea the extent to which the people involved in that case in doing the investigative journalism, the extent to which they uncovered the degree of abuse. And this is what happens anytime you talk about any systemic institutionalized abuse, is that you don't know the extent of it, and many times it's a lot deeper and up to the top, as you can that you never would have guessed. And so by the end of that movie, I was just floored. And I remember the evolution in my thinking about sexual abuse. Very early on, when I was still Mormon, I thought, well, Catholics probably have some pedophile problems because they're all celibate, and so it distorts human sexuality, and so of course there's going to be abuse because of the celibacy teaching. And the more that I saw then this happen in Boy Scouts, in an organization that's not affiliated with any particular religion, and the more I studied power dynamics, when you have authority figures and you start to realize that those sources of power that deal with children become a magnet for people who would abuse and exploit that situation. And I've started to realize that the problem is not celibacy. It's not isolated to Catholicism or anything. It's anytime you have these authority figures in a position where they have access to vulnerable populations. And those vulnerable populations may be children, they may be elderly. And so understanding the extent of the abuse, seeing the systemic nature of it so you can identify what things facilitate it, is so important for promoting the type of change that we need to see in any religion, but in our home religion of Mormonism in particular.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. And it's, the idea that all of these isolated incidences are just an issue at the local level. I mean, there's obviously some truth to that, because it's not like a stake president, when they're looking for who's going to be the new stake president, it's not like they're trying to find the local pedophile to call the local pedophile. And I also don't really think that they would keep somebody in the position if they knew, if a high enough person knew that there was a pedophile that had committed some act. I do think they would probably take appropriate steps to at least remove that person from their position. But what I think cannot be lost on the information that's presented in this document is that the church deals with sexual abuse accusations on a mass scale. And they're dealing with it up to the highest levels, and the members do not know that. Now, do the members have a right to know that they're dealing with these issues? Of course, they don't have a right to know necessarily the specifics of the cases. We have victims that need to be protected, And even to a certain extent, the accused have a right to be protected, especially in cases where maybe something hasn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt. So I'm not what I'm about, what I'm saying here. I'm not suggesting that every time there's a settlement that the church should publish the minutes and the notes on such a settlement. But I do think that members have a right to know, for example, in 2016, the LDS, we spent $200 million on settlements related to sex abuse, or whatever the number is. Even if it's just a general number like that, because a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from active Mormons and comments that I've seen who have reacted to this document, almost all of it goes along the lines of nothing to see here. Every organization has some bad apples, and these are just some of the bad apples, and it doesn't reflect on the organization as a whole. Well, there is some truth to that statement, okay? Because I don't think anybody, I know at least me, I'm not suggesting that it's like some sex club, that the LDS Church is some sort of pedophile club where they're trying to help out their pedophile friends to get access to children. I don't think that's what's going on. But so it is local issues, but what is not a local issue is that Kirkton McConkie, the law firm for the church, has a division within their organization that specifically is formed to handle the sexual abuse claims that the church gets. They have a team of lawyers that's all they do. And so but the average member doesn't know that. And that's not a bad thing. It doesn't have to be a bad thing or a good thing. It just is what it is. And I think that the people should understand that, and this goes along with the broader goal of transparency, that, if you want to look at the bullet list of things that I think the church needs to be transparent about, to me, one of them is the extent to which sexual abuse affects the church, not only in a number of instances, but monetary damages. Because if you're going to be donating your hard-earned money to an organization, I think you have a right to know what percentage of that money is going to settle sex abuse cases.
Yeah, and there's the whole process of improving and safeguarding an institution involves looking at the times when things go bad, and then seeing what are the risk factors that led to that can then give you a focus for institutional change to mitigate that in the future. Now you think about, an airline, okay, you have a plane that crashes. Well, after the crash, they do an intensive investigation to find out what are the things that led to this that we can change to safeguard it in the future. Now, if you don't have any of that transparency where everybody can see what's going on from a broad spectrum, they don't need to know the details, but a simple factor such as $200 million paid in settlements. And then if that goes on, then people can say, well, wait a second, there's something that we can change institutionally. Now, to give you an example of how this works, I think there's an Australian commission that over the past couple of years has been investigating the Jehovah's Witnesses, because there was a series of cases of repeat sexual abuse and other offenses. And so there was an official government investigation where they called the highest level of leadership of their governing body in to be interrogated and to be interviewed and questioned about their policy. And it came out that, they had policies, for example, that they wouldn't believe an allegation unless there were two witnesses to the allegation, which meant that, if there was an instance where one leader was abusing one child, the only two people involved in that were the perpetrator and the victim. And the perpetrator is not going to come forth as a witness. And so it was a policy institutional issue that facilitated and perpetuated abuse. And as a result of that investigation, that policy has been changed. So we know that external pressure can change these entrenched organizations that are drunk on their own power and don't think that they have to change. Financial and legal consequences are sometimes what it takes to make those changes. And it doesn't matter if you are a true believing Mormon who believes it all or somebody else. I mean, I think in both of those perspectives, you should know that there's a reason for this type of oversight, accountability, and change. Because if you're a believing Mormon, then you've been told by Dieter Uchtdorf and by a bunch of other people that the leaders are not perfect. And if the leader is susceptible to any degree of imperfection, they're susceptible to every degree of imperfection. And that includes sexual abuse. Now, we know that there have been general authorities who were convicted pedophiles. We talked recently about the excommunication of one of our 70s, Hamula, and they keep saying this hasn't happened for 30 years. Well, if you go back 30 years ago, George P. Lee was a general authority that was released and excommunicated. And it came out several years later that he was on the sex registry because of using his authority, that imbalance of power, to exploit and abuse children.
Yeah, and look, I think one of the things that gets lost on the church and members of the church who want to try to act like these problems only exist in other religions. One of the many philosophies that I live by in my life, not just with just me, but with, when I'm judging other people and whether or not I consider them to be, good people or people I want to associate with. Mormons will often accuse people like us of wanting the church to be perfect. Well, you can't expect the church to be perfect, right? They'll say something like that, which goes along with what you're saying. Uchtdorf says, well, they're fallible. Great. I think we all agree. To me, it's not the mistakes that get made or whether or not a mistake gets made, because granted, mistakes will be made. To me, it's how do you handle yourself after the mistake? I want to know, what did you do after the mistake? And now I can know what kind of a person you are. Because if I'm going to expect that, if I'm going to say I'm never going to associate with anybody that's ever cheated on their wife, well, chances are if everybody was completely honest with me, I'd lose a bunch of friends, maybe. Maybe I would, maybe I wouldn't, I don't know. But to me, it would be more important to know if they cheated on their wife. As bad as that is, I would want to know what their actions were afterwards and how they remedied that mistake. And so when I look at the church and sexual abuse, I'm not suggesting that an instance or even many instances of sexual abuse doesn't necessarily mean that there's, cover-ups at the top. There could be, but I'm saying that in and of itself doesn't mean that. I want to see how are they handling these instances of sexual abuse. And that's where you're going to be able to say the church is either doing a good job or they're not. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but my point is, a lot of Mormons, they think that critics of the church are pointing to this document and saying, look at all these instances of sexual abuse. The church must not be true. That's not what we're saying, because it's more about how those instances were handled than the fact that they occurred.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have friends who were Catholic and they knew a lot of problems with the Catholic Church, but they were willing to go because they considered, the church moving forward and gaining in life. But then when they saw how the church handled known cases of abuse, hiding and perpetuating those abuses, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. It wasn't that the abuse happened, it's how they happened it. So I think your point is well made. I want to do something a little different. Since when I first this, I said this is the spotlight moment for Mormonism, and there are a lot of people who may not have watched Spotlight. I think it may have been rated R, and so if you're a Mormon, you probably didn't watch the movie. But when I watched it, I thought this is a very important movie because of it shows things come to light. And I think that I'm hoping that what we're at now is the beginning of Mormonism's spotlight moment. But I want to show the trailer just so that we can get a sense of, when we talk about this being a spotlight moment, what this means. So I'm going to go ahead and hit play on this, and then we can talk about it. Hold on.
I know there's things you cannot tell me, but I also know there's a story here, and I think everybody will hear about it.
Do you think your paper has the resources to take that on?
I do. Do you?
The Boston priest molested kids in 6 different parishes over the last 30 years. The church found out about it and did nothing. We haven't committed any long-term investigative resources to the case.
No, we haven't.
And that's the kind of thing your team would do.
Spotlight? Guys, listen. Everybody's going to be interested in this.
Obviously, the church will fight us very hard.
I'm trying to get some background information.
I don't want you recording this in any way, shape, or form. Nothing.
We understand you've settled several cases against the church.
I can't discuss that.
There aren't any records of any of these settlements.
Nope.
When you're a poor kid from a poor family and when a priest pays attention to you, it's a big deal. How do you say no to God? Spotlight.
Just the tip line.
You think you've got something?
I want to keep digging.
We need to focus on the institution. Show me that it came from the top down.
They'll try to silence anyone who speaks out.
You leave me alone, you hear me, goddammit?
6% act out sexually.
6% is 90. 90 priests.
If there were 90 of these bastards, people would know.
Maybe they do. You're going to give me the names of their victims. Are you threatening me?
I was doing my job.
Yeah, you and everyone else.
I am here because I care. We're going to tell this story. We're going to tell it right.
I'm hoping we can keep this between us until we all get on the same page.
Is that why we're here, to get on the same page? We've got two stories here. A story about degenerate clergy, and a story about a bunch of lawyers turning child abuse into a cottage industry. Which story do you want us to write? Because we're writing one of them.
I'm not crazy. They control everything.
This is not just Boston. It's the whole country. It's the whole world.
They knew, and they let it happen. It could have been you. It could have been me. It could have been any of us.
Man, even that trailer itself, some of the concepts that it really brings out, I think are so meaningful for people paying attention to this. You know, you've got at the beginning, they know about the level and the extent of the abuse and they did nothing. Well, when we look at the church, I think anyone who's familiar with Mormon culture will be able to identify with you if they've stepped away from believing that the brethren are these perfect people. Then there's very key things that you can identify that are problematic. Number one is the presumption that priesthood leaders are somehow more moral or can be trusted, the presumption of trust. There's isolated, protected one-on-one interviews where untrained, unaccountable religious leaders have closed-door discussions about private, intimate sexual issues with the youth of the church. These are the worthiness interviews that happen for temple visits and for just regular checkups. You know, those are instances in which you're not saying that everybody's abuser by saying that that's a risk factor or a situation which may foster abuse. And when I say foster abuse, it becomes a focus for people who are susceptible to taking advantage of that situation to do that, to take advantage of it.
Well, and one of the reasons why there is this built-in trust is partially because the leaders say there should be, but the other reason is because these instances get covered up so well, and so few people really know about them at the end of the day. Or like you said earlier, sometimes even if there's one that gets a lot of news, it ends up fading and becomes a real blip on the radar, is that a lot of Mormons think that there's not a lot of sexual abuse in the church. And if they happen to see it in their local ward, a lot of them think that it's a one-off. And so a document like this shows that it is not a one-off. And I think people, like, I'm going to just keep pounding this drum until the church figures it out. People have a right to know.
Yeah.
Stats, both how many instances are occurring every year and also how much money is being paid out to keep it quiet. Because these things are not just to make these victims whole as best they can. These settlements also serve the purpose to silence them. Every single one of these settlements legally shuts their mouth with a key, with a lock and key, if they ever want to keep any of that money. And they cannot tell their story. And I want people to think about that, because you know that in any kind of victim situation, sharing your story goes a long way, not just to heal yourself, but to help other people. And these victims that are entering into these settlement agreements cannot legally tell their stories now. The church does not want them to tell their story.
Exactly. And we saw that in the Spotlight movie. A big key part of the Spotlight movie was getting court documents unsealed or have had access to them. And you're right, you know, when it gets settled, those stories become silent, because anytime the reality of abuse comes forward, and you see this in the news with any instances of abuse where one person comes forward and says, this happened to me, then you'll find other people who say, well, the same thing happened to me. And then you really start to understand the extent of the abuse and the risk that you run.
You know, one of the issues, and I'll bet this is probably, I'm sure there's a parallel with the Catholic Church and other religions, but I think one of the reasons why we're where we are today is because of the fact that we haven't always had the internet. And there was a time when the church was able to control the message, and they took advantage of that in many different ways, one of them being able to make sexual abuse not become a public discussion. They had the ability to settle these things, to keep them quiet, and nobody knew. There was no way for somebody to compile a document like this. And because that was the standard operating procedure for, 100 years or however long, all of a sudden the internet comes around, and instead of adjusting, they're really just retrenching in that matter. But I'm hoping that the power of the internet will chisel into that a little bit, and maybe people will be, because I get contacted a lot from victims of sexual abuse and people who've been involved in it and that have some knowledge in it, and I hear stories that are all end up being almost identical stories. You just got to change the names of the people involved, and unfortunately, for legal reasons and all this stuff, they can never hand the documents over to me. But that might change one day. There might be somebody that says, hey, screw it, I don't care what the legal consequences are, this has to get out there. And I think the more attention we bring to it, the more likely that's going to happen one day.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's my hope too, is that the buildup of the social pressure, the moral clarity that comes when you start to see these issues and you start to realize what the focus that promotes the abuse is, people will start to say no more. We've got to do something about it. And it may be something as simple as, like, if you look at the procedure, like in the manuals, in the handbook of instructions that all of the bishops have, when they hear reports of abuse, they look up in the manual, and right now it says, if you hear a report of abuse, here's the hotline, call us. And they call the number and they get, I guess, the legal department that's there. But it says there, the reason that they do that is, you want to avoid getting unnecessarily entangled in legal stuff, but we also have to protect the good name and reputation of the church. So to the extent that when we're talking about children's abuse, like, if the good name and reputation of the church is a factor anywhere in that calculation about how they respond to it, I think that's a problem. Now, you can do a comparison. You can look, okay, well, how do other institutions do it? Well, in Mormonism, leaders are instructed to first contact the church, and then they'll decide and they'll tell you how to proceed with contacting local authorities and so forth. But the order is church first, then authorities. Now, you can go to the Community of Christ, which is the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can look at their policy manual that the leaders have, and it says specifically there, you don't have to contact their legal department first. You can contact if you're the local leader, you hear of abuse, you can contact the police right away. You don't have to check with them. They say, please, in tandem or after you call the police, contact us.
And Jonathan,
that's because their priority. Go ahead.
Well, I just, you just made me think of something. I've seen several comments from Mormons where they've been discussing this document, and there'll be somebody saying, does anybody know what the church's policy is? And somebody will come in and say what you just said about having to contact the legal department. And whenever the conversation goes to, well, do they contact the legal authorities? I've seen multiple people well, it depends on the state, because some states require them to talk to legal authorities, and
Ryan,
they don't.
Can you repeat that? You froze up for just a second.
Okay. They'll say something like, well, it depends on the state, on whether or not they're going to contact the authorities, because some states require it and some don't. And then they give this whole justification about why that's okay. But do they realize what they're saying? Like, why would you care if it's mandatory or not? Isn't it automatic? Shouldn't it be automatic that you contact the authorities? How is it justified that that's dependent on the state's law on the mandatory reporting? That's disgusting me, and they don't get it. They don't get it.
I agree. Well, I mean, what I think, because I've had similar conversations, and I think if you talk with a church leader, they will become very somber, and they'll say, well, the penitent ecclesiastical confidentiality is a sacred trust, and if we were to betray that trust when somebody comes forth with a confession of abuse, then we would lose the trust of the entire membership, and we would not get people confessing those things in the future, because we want to help these victims rehabilitate. And usually, I mean, that, you know, they try to hide behind that thing, and they'll say, well, you know, we're gonna try to convince the perpetrator to confess and to go forward. But what that's doing is it's prioritizing the interest and the safety of the perpetrator, rather than centering the focus on the victim and on any potential future victims or any of the other victims, because many of these abusers aren't just focusing on one kid. And while we're talking about abusers,
they would never, those leaders that say that would never say that if it was their kids being abused.
Well, exactly. But remember, you know, they're protecting the good name of the church and the reputation of the church is a priority, and that's in the documentation. Now, the church could change that, and I'm hoping that the type of pressures that this document's release and these discussions about it are going to bring onto the leaders is that the changes such as no more one-on-one interviews with bishops, parents present for every and any worthiness interview with a child, you know, a policy where if reports of abuse happen to any church leaders, that they're allowed to go directly to any law enforcement agencies that are necessary, and that there's a uniform policy that does that. You know, other changes would be so that members themselves don't feel like they should be shamed or guilt for simply asking for that type of accountability. Because I think members now, you know, if you go to your bishop and you say, you will not be interviewing my child alone for any reason at all. If there's an interview, you contact me and we'll see if it's necessary. You're instantly going to be perceived as confrontational, as not trusting your leader. And that's wrong. You know, I'm a physician. When I worked in a hospital, anytime I went in with a vulnerable person, whether it was a child or a woman, there always had to be another witness that was right there. And I didn't perceive that as an accusation against me. That was a safeguard for the system. It was an institutional safeguard that is centered on both protecting the victim as well as protecting the organization. Because the church should really shift its thinking about this. You know, changing these policies is not admitting that they don't have the power and authority that they have. What it is doing is creating a safer environment for everyone so that instances of abuse and thus liability for the church are reduced. So I think if they just had a shift in their perspective, that these things are very, very possible. And hopefully this type of release will promote that change. There was one other thing in that Spotlight documentary, the trailer, we saw that there were, one of the things one of the victims comes to them and says is, you know, if you are sitting there with a mouthpiece of God and he's telling you these things, how are you going to say no to God? And I think that very clearly articulates the imbalance of power and the vulnerability that the victims of this type of abuse have. Now, you've gone through some of the document. Are there any cases in particular that stood out to you, or that
first of all, it's been months since I've ever looked at any of the files, and I didn't ever look at all 300 plus. The most of the ones that I looked at were the Boy Scout ones. I looked at almost all of those, and I just, you know. Now,
correct me if I'm wrong, but when there was this whole issue about Boy Scout abuse, there was actually a leak of Boy Scout cases, of like a database that contained a lot of information about cases that was.
I don't think it was a leak. I mean, maybe it was and I'm wrong, but my understanding is that there was some sort of court something or some legal pressure or something that caused the Boy Scouts to release all of those documents, and then the LA Times published the database.
Okay. Yeah, so and if you Google Boy Scouts perversion file, then you'll see. I'm looking at it now.
I can't remember if it was a leak or not, but you can go to that database.
It may have been very similar to this, where they just collated cases from everything.
Yeah. Well, no, because I think this was where the Boy Scouts actually turned over. Because if you look at some of those files, they're actually the internal memos of the cases. But
Oh, okay.
anyway, you can go to that database and you can look at every Boy Scout case there's ever been, whether it's related to the Mormon Church or not. Deb, through her research, tried to isolate all of the Mormon-related ones, and there were maybe even some that she missed, which is one of the reasons why she wants this to be a living document. So if people who go to it, they'll see that there's sort of a thing of, if you know of cases that have been documented out there. She's not really looking for people to like tell their story. I mean, I'm sure she's willing to hear people's story if they need somebody to talk to, but she's not really looking for somebody to tell their story, to add their story to it. She's looking more for documented cases that are not in the document that we can add. And then, if every time she adds like 10 new ones, then we'll update the document on our website or something like that.
Okay, well, let's just take a look at the document for a little bit here. So this is a blow-up of the front page of the document. Instances of child sexual abuse allegedly perpetrated by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, we have to use the word allegedly here because this is all documentation that has not gone through the normal court system. But the information here sometimes includes material obtained under oath by representatives from the church, whether it's a local leader or something like that. And so you get some information that's very relevant to the question of sexual abuse. There's Deb's name and credentials. She starts out by giving a pretty good overview of the problem of sexual abuse. She talks about the impact of sexual abuse in the lives of the victims. Then she talks a little bit about the predators themselves. The child predator on average will abuse almost 200 children in their lifetime. Some have admitted over 1,000 children. A child predator will abuse 50 to 75 children before they are caught, but only 3% may be apprehended. 86% of child sexual abuse is never reported.
That's a big one right there, because look how many cases, if that stat is true, and I don't doubt it, but I don't know what her sourcing is on that. If that's an accurate stat, look at how many cases are in this document and then apply that stat to it.
Yeah, exactly. And then we go on, and that was actually a point that was made in the Spotlight movie. They talked about how many cases they had, and then they got a number of the percent of which are reported. And they said, if this is how much we have, then the number that are actually out there, the number of perpetrators is far much greater. It's kind of like roaches. When you see one, there's really a lot more. So she goes down and she talks a little bit about where these cases came from. She lists legal complaints, court orders on motions, appellate court rulings, documents from the Boy Scout perversion files, and news articles. And then she goes through, and we can take a look at a series of these cases. There's one in particular that is right at the beginning that made a very big splash, I think, when the document was released. And I'm just going to highlight that quote here. So in the very first case, which is a case regarding a bishop named Samuel H. Gardner, who allegedly abused a child. The child states, "When I was 15 years old, I was being sexually abused by my bishop." And it's referenced in one of the documents that she has supporting this. And then it quotes from the document, "Bishops begin interviewing children when they're young. Mormon children are supposed to be interviewed by the bishop when they're 8 years old to see if they're ready for baptism. And when a boy reaches the age of 12, he's interviewed by a bishop to see if he's worthy to receive the Aaronic priesthood. And the interview is conducted behind closed doors." Now, if you want to get a sense of the degree to which these interviews get very personal at the age of 8, there's a video on the Thoughts on Things and Stuff page about a father having a discussion with the bishop, where the father is protesting the bishop talking about issues of masturbation and sexuality with an 8-year-old, and the bishop is fighting back against the father, saying, "No, it's my responsibility to talk about these things with your 8-year-old, and you need to submit to my authority." And I've provided the transcript for that document. I'll put a link in the description of this video so you can see when we talk about Mormons and this concept of bishops and authority, we are not joking around and they are not joking around. They get into it. So let's go back to see where this continues. Unfortunately, some Mormon bishops have been accused of using these interviews as an opportunity to sexually abuse young men. Since the bishop is supposed to have special authority from God, sexual advances by the bishop tend to greatly confuse young men. And that's the same sort of confusion that you see articulated in that Spotlight movie. Furthermore, it's very difficult for those who are abused to accuse the bishop of wrongdoing, and consequently, they bottle up their feelings. Now, why do you suppose it would be the case that victims have a hard time accusing the bishop of wrongdoing in Mormon culture?
Yeah, I mean, there's the grooming aspect that is largely unintentional that the church has, where any leaders, whether it be the prophet, a 70, mission president, stake president, bishop, so on and so forth, they're put on a pedestal of they've been called by God at this time, at this place, and they are, giving their life of service to this position, and they're inspired to be able to administer over you if you live within their zip code, spiritually. And so
I think you hit the nail on the head. When I was called to be the facilities guy, and this is like where I have to like coordinate people cleaning the toilets, okay? The bishop came to me and he said, I want you to know that God has chosen you for this calling. This is God's intention for your calling. And I sat there and so that's the toilet guy, okay? Yeah. So if God is calling the toilet guy, that's one thing. But when we understand, and there's this whole web of trust, not only am I going to trust the bishop because God called him, and God would not call a pedophile because God knows everybody's heart and mind. But not only that, but God also called the stake president who called the bishop.
Well,
the
and
same
also,
sort of trust
and
happens there.
If it's a smaller community, it's very likely that your parents have known this bishop for years and years and years outside of him being a bishop, and they're maybe even friends. And so there's trust on top of trust on top of trust built in.
Yeah. And so when we look at these things and we're critical, we're not saying don't, all of your friends are pedophiles. We're just simply saying you need to change the way that you perceive how these institutions of power should work. And the way that they should work, transparency, accountability, policies which are cognizant of risk factors for abuse and these imbalances of power, and take steps to mitigate it, take steps to eliminate those areas of problems. And that's one of them. And unfortunately, Mormonism, it's really hard because this concept of divine authority, divine calling, and the trust implicit to that is inherent to Mormonism. And if you're a critic of Mormonism, you look all the way as far back as Joseph Smith and how he groomed a 14-year-old girl and prepared her to accept and consent to certain things that she wouldn't otherwise. And you can find the root of the abuse of power and authority going that far back. But let's continue, because this one case, this first case, brings up some very interesting points. In the next section, we're given a quote from Jack McAllister. Standard church policy is that 2 priesthood officers must be present to handle church funds, a check and balance system to prevent financial error and inhibit the temptation to steal. And the church conducts regular financial audits. How many priesthood officers are required to conduct a personal worthiness interview with a youth? 1. And if there are no procedures for auditing the actions of these leaders for inappropriate behaviors. Now, I was a clerk. I was a financial clerk, and I remember this. We had to have 2 people when we were counting the tithing. We had to have 2 people, and we were recording it. And not only was it 2 people in the office while you're doing the sorting and the tallying, but then when you're taking the little envelope and you're going to deposit in the bank, there had to be 2 people carrying that envelope all the way to deposit it in the bank.
Yeah.
And that's because that's where the value is. They don't want to lose the money. People are susceptible to embezzlement, to temptation to steal. This paragraph makes the point that if we're safeguarding the money, and we know that there's people at risk for that, safeguarding our children when we know that there's a risk for that? And you say, well, that, you know, we can't know. Well, the fact that there's an arm of the Curtin McConkie attorney's office devoted to handling cases of sexual abuse means they know. All right. Now they bring up Jack McAllister, and his story is actually very interesting, and I want to keep going with this. So Jack McAllister was especially concerned about these worthiness of their interviews because he himself was abused by his bishop in his office. And he tells his story. And so this is Jack McAllister. Now, we were the only ones in the meeting house. We shook hands and he put his arms around me. He told me how much the Lord loved me. He felt directly inspired tonight to call me down to his office. He asked if we could pray together before we talked. He said a lot of really nice things about me to God. I felt very special and very humble. It was one of the most beautiful, heartfelt, eloquent prayers that I've ever heard on my behalf, asking the Lord to bless me, to watch over me, to care for me, and assuring the Lord of what a fine, wonderful young man I was. Then we sat down in 2 chairs in front of his desk. He pulled his chair really close to mine, looked me straight in the eyes through his pink-tinted bifocal lenses. I could see he still had tears in his eyes from the prayer. What sincerity, I thought. Maybe someday I can learn how to talk to God with such powerful, impressive prayer language. After some conversation about temporal matters, the bishop proceeded to discuss sexual matters with him and eventually molested him. The abuse caused severe trauma to Jack. He wrote, "I couldn't figure out what was going on. He was the bishop. I was the obedient but unworthy servant. He was God's chosen leader on the earth. Whatever he did was directly authorized by God. My thoughts raced around." Jack McAllister decided to keep the matter secret. Even though he eventually became a bishop, his suffering did not end. To add to his own pain, he learned that his own son was also victimized by another Mormon bishop. In a letter to Gordon B. Hinckley, the current president of the Mormon Church at the time that this was written, Jack and his wife Meredith expressed their dismay that things were being swept under the rug. Now, I want to point out this story is being repeated from the Salt Lake City Messenger Utah Lighthouse Ministry, the Tanner's newsletter. We'll talk about that in a sec. Let's talk quickly about what Jack is describing happened. And you mentioned grooming just a little bit ago. What is your understanding of grooming?
Well, I mean, I understand it that you're slowly creating an environment to where not only can the abuse happen, but the victim is going to be less likely to turn you in because of, you know, whatever the form of grooming has been.
Yeah, and I think what he describes right there is preparing the person psychologically to accept what is happening in the future. He's already set the tone of being very pious and religious. There's already this hierarchy of authority. You know, he was inspired to call the young men down, so God himself is involved in this interaction. And when you talk to people and when you read research about sexual abuse, the predators who engage in this type of abuse are very calculating, and they're very manipulative, and they can be like chameleons, and they can be what they need to be in order to achieve their aims. And it's this insidious nature of it which makes releases like this so important, because the public can start to see the extent to which they can hide in their midst. And so all of your normal red flags you can't trust, and you need to understand you can't trust them. You've got to really change the institution, change the policies to safeguard against these things.
Yeah.
I brought up that it was from the Tanners because the Tanners, if you're Mormon and you're in Utah, for decades have been known as, you know, the evil anti-Mormons, who all they want to do is tear down the church. And so a believing Mormon may look at this account and maybe empathize with it, but then as soon as they see that it's from the Tanners newsletter, they're like, oh, well, they're just trying to tear down the church. You know, I can't even believe that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine too, but of course they can only say that for a few documents here. Most of these are news reports and actual original documentation, and even sometimes, as you can see, the Deseret News. So, but yeah, I agree with you that people will look for any reason to discredit any of these stories.
Yeah, and when you read through and you go through these documents and you see them, you start to realize that, you know, we've paid some attention and focused on high-level leadership at the local level, just like bishops and stuff like that. But it goes to scout leaders that have that position by nature of their church calling. It goes to, just concerned older gentlemen who can always claim priesthood authority, whether it's home teaching companionship or that they are in, the young men's leadership. It's a pervasive problem that we can't address as a church unless we know the extent to which it exists. And that's where these types of documents can be so powerful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the purpose for kind of getting you on to talk about this was really so that I could have a chance just to get some of the background of, how this document came into existence and the intention of it, but then have just a brief discussion about the importance of it and what we'd like to see from here on out. Now, what would you like to see happen as the next steps? And we'll close out with this question.
Well, I mean, I do hope that on a certain level, that this will inspire additional people to come out with their stories. I don't think that there's ever enough stories to be told, and these, when people come out and tell their stories, it helps, promote the change, promote the awareness, and things like that. But really, I want to see solutions, right? I'm not one of these guys that says I can't wait for the church to burn down and disappear, because I don't think it ever will. So, since the church is going to be here for the long term, I would like for documents like this to put enough pressure on the church to make substantive changes within their organization. You mentioned one of them of mandatory parents being involved in any interview type of a thing, and all this kind of stuff. And the other thing too is I would like to see the church aggressively prosecute, press charges against whatever have you, against these perpetrators. I realize that in some cases there may be a situation where you also have to have the cooperation from the victim, and that cooperation might not be there, but that's not going to be in every single case. I want to see that the church send a message to these people that if they get caught, that the church will do everything in their power to go to prison. And I don't think that the church, not only does the church not do everything in their power, but nobody thinks that they're going to do everything in their power. I'd like that messaging to change. The other thing would be, I do think that people have a right to know what the stats are. I'm not saying they have to go and announce it at general conference, when they're announcing all the other stats. They don't have to do that. But I think that if they had a website, let's say, just like they have the Mormon and gay website, if they had a Mormon and sex abuse website, whatever they were to call it, where they had resources, and they even talked about how, you better not get caught or we're going to make sure you go to jail type of stuff. But they could also have a page there where they discuss the stats, maybe even like a state by state stat or whatever, number of instances, what the demographics are, the age ranges, so people can be aware. Awareness helps in prevention, and I think included in those stats should be every year how much the church spent on settlements.
Yeah.
So I think I would be I think that would be, if they did all those things. Honestly, I don't even know what else I would be able to criticize, because I'm not criticizing the church because there's abuse. Because you cannot control. I mean, you can do things to help prevent, but you cannot prevent it 100%. Okay,
yeah.
So it's how they handle the abuse, and I don't know if there would be any room for criticism in the realm of sex abuse if they did those things.
Yeah, the thing that infuriates me is anytime you make an appeal to the high level authorities about abuse, they always just shuffle accountability down to the lower level. Oh, well, we can't do anything to prevent abuse at the lower level. And I think what you've just pointed out is that is absolutely wrong. There's a lot that they can do.
Oh, of course.
You can change policies. You can have this type of accountability and transparency that lets people know how we're doing and can point out to where we need to change. And
they're missing a huge, I mean, the church loves good PR. They're missing a huge PR home run here. Can you imagine if the church aggressively tried to put their abusers in prison and work with the local prosecutors? And I mean, they would be celebrated in every news outlet that wrote a story about it, about how the church made sure this guy got what was coming to him. You know, everybody would love it.
Well, that would be the chance that they could go that far. I agree that it would be a good PR thing, and you got to ask, you know, what are the legal implications? Would they, you know, as the church, they weren't themselves the victim, would they have the legal standing to press charges? How would that proceed?
Well, that would be one of the things. But what I will say, and I realize that, yeah, they're not necessarily the victims, but they should be doing everything they can to promote, to encourage the victim to press charges, to get the police involved, and to make sure that people know, hey, if you get caught doing this, you know, we might not be successful in putting you in prison, but we're sure as heck going to try.
Right. Where people understand that when you go to trial, the church is not going to be sitting with your attorney on your side trying to defend you.
Now,
they're going to be there.
Something that might be a little bit more, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's all right.
You know, something that might be a little more controversial, and I wouldn't go as far to say that they have to do this, but I don't think it would be the worst thing in the world to have some sort of way to convey to LDS church members if they have a convicted pedophile among their ranks. I mean, we have sex offender registries. I know that when I bought the house that I live in, one of the first things my wife did before we bought the house was check the sex offender registry for the neighborhood we live in. You know, I'm not suggesting that the church be outing people who've been accused or who have even where there's been settlements involved. I'm talking about where there's been actual criminal cases that have been adjudicated. And I'm not saying they should create their own database, but you know, maybe on each ward, most wards have websites or Facebook pages. You know, maybe have a link in the bar of, you know, here's a link to the local sex offender registry list that you can look in our zip code or something like that. Just because it's awareness, And if there's somebody
a cross table match between the word directory and the state sex offender list, and so you know, those things can be made known.
Yeah, and I mean, look, people have a right to know, and if it's going to cause some uncomfortable situation for that sex offender, well, I don't really care. I mean, you know, he doesn't have to go to church, you know.
Yeah, well, and again, that's the thing where awareness and knowledge are empowering and protective, and we see that in every aspect of, you know, we see that in a lot of issues coming out of Mormonism and turning back and seeing the problems, but this is where you're talking about the vulnerability exposed by having children in these situations is just so important.
Yep.
And the other thing about that story that we read is that there was one guy who was abused when he was a kid. He grew up, became a bishop, and then he realized that his son was also abused by a completely unrelated thing. And so with that one data point, you should have an idea that we're not talking about just, you know, 1 in a million happening here.
Yeah.
This is out there.
I mean, most Mormon families have sex abuse in their family. Maybe not in their immediate family, but in their extended family if they look close enough. I know in my family, not in my immediate family that I'm aware of, but definitely among, you know, a group of second or third cousins of mine, I know that there was some massive sex abuse and an even bigger cover-up. And it was something that happened, my understanding, back in the 60s and 70s. But yeah, I mean, a lot of our families have been affected by it in one way or the other, whether we realize it or not.
All right. So your ideal leak, like if you could say that the next leak that you would like, what would you ideally like to have land in your lap?
Well, I don't really like to get into, like, you know, my wish list or anything. I really don't have a wish list. You know, we're here to accept any documents that people feel, you know, their conscience tells them that they should be made public. If they want to use the power of our reputation to make those documents public, we're here for anything. And if it furthers transparency and accountability, then it's on my wish list.
All right.
You can just assume it's there.
Sounds good. Ryan, I want to thank you for taking the time to have this brief discussion with us. And I'm right there with you, hoping that we can start to have a change to create a safer, healthier environment for people who remain in the church. You know, I have family members who are in the church, and I want to see them in a protective, safe, accountable environment. And so this type of change is exactly what we're looking for.
Thank you for the opportunity, Jonathan, and it was a pleasure to talk to you about this stuff.
All right. Take care.
All right.